Go.
Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you. I know it is a very busy time in the school year, in schools as you begin the new school year. So we are excited to have you live. If you have decided to leverage this webinar as an asynchronous resource, we are glad you're here too. You are at the Guidelines 3.0 webinar from the CECL Project, California Coalition for Inclusive Learning. Hopefully you're eager to learn more on this topic as we will be sharing the overarching themes of the UDL Guidelines 3.0 and practical ways to leverage these guidelines.
We are excited to welcome everybody in on that first slide. If we go back, make sure that all of our friends have access. You'll find a QR code that will take you to a home base document. There is a bit.ly there as well, bit.ly/, all caps, CCIL-30. You'll be able to find resources to the slides, as well as the home base document that has a collection of all of our CECL webinars. So really happy to have you. I see folks are still kind of filing in the room. So let's go ahead and take care of the logistics and the business as we're getting ready to dive in. For those of you that are new to joining the CECL team, we welcome you. The California Coalition for Inclusive Learning is a grant funded in partnership by the California Department of Education, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and the lead recipient in that grant this year is Placer County Office of Education, with a large amount of support and collaboration with our partners at CAS. So we're really grateful for the support and the opportunity to come together in learning in support of students and educators in California. If we look at our next slide, you'll see the original and some new members. So the CECL project started about 5 years ago with a collection of 5 county offices of education. We had Fresno, Los Angeles, San Joaquin County, Santa Clara, and Placer were the original partners in the grant, along with CAST. This year, we are thrilled to have added the Sonoma County Office of Education, as well as the Valley to Coast Collaborative and CFAC, which is the Capital Central Foothill Area Consortium. So if you are anywhere in California and you want some more information about UDL, there are some great opportunities to partner with the county offices there, as well as contacting me directly, and we can set you up with additional support and resources for free. So excited to dive into this update on the guidelines and excited for the partnership. So with that, I will pass it along to our partners at CAST.
Sorry, without further ado, let's hear from Melissa Sanjay and Dr. Shantae Singer.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Melissa Sanjay. I am an implementation specialist at CAST. What that means is I get to fly around the country, sometimes the world, and teach teachers, school leaders, district leaders, and sometimes state officials, universal design for learning and applications in their unique contexts, whether that means their classroom, their school buildings, their districts, and so on. And I have spent a lot of time working with the CECL project out in California, to the point where my colleagues in California will say I might need to have a timeshare or something there, because I am there that often. So I'm so excited to get to talk to you from where I'm sitting now, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. Quickly, prior to CAST, I was first a clinical social worker, then a teacher, then a principal for about 17 years of alternative high schools in Boston. And I have with me my colleague, Shantae.
Hello, everyone. I am Shantae Singer, and I too work at CAS. As you can see, I have a unique role of having one foot in research and development and the other foot in professional learning. And so I like to think that I am somewhat of a bridge between research and practice. So it's a fun position to be in, and am loving this journey that we are about to take you on in updating you and giving you some enhancements to the UDL guidelines. Like Melissa, prior to coming to CAST, I was a teacher. Special education is my background. So special education teacher in DC public schools. And I was just saying that's 24 years ago. I'm so dating myself. But I also have been a director of special education and instructional specialist for Baltimore County Public Schools, where I started my UDL journey about 20 years ago. And I'm still on this journey. I truly believe in this framework. And like I said, I'm excited to be here with y'all. I am in Texas, big old state of Texas. And so we have had a lot of initiatives around UDL, and I'm super excited about where these enhancements to our guidelines is taking us. So welcome everyone. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, and Shantae was on the working group that helped prepare these 3.0 guidelines. So I'm so happy to have her with us today to share all of her wisdom. So CAST, where we come from, most of you probably already know about CAST, but very quickly, CAST is the authors of the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines and the authors of the Universal Design for Learning Framework. And our mission is CAST leads, inspires, and convenes a global community to design equitable, inclusive learning experiences through our Universal Design for Learning framework. Towards, as our tagline says, learning has no limits. So we're hoping that these 3.0 guidelines will continue that and expand it. And we'll talk about the 3.0 guidelines is not so much of a change, but an expansion. So we're hoping that'll expand it to catch more learners and to include more learners and offer them access to the curriculum and agency in their learning. So how are we gonna interact today? We would love it if you would use our chat box. We love having dialogue back and forth. So our chat box, you can use at any time to introduce yourself. Feel free to put your name in and where you're coming from. Now, if you'd like to do that, you can ask a question or you can answer a question. You could share an idea or connection that you're seeing. Sometimes people will quote something that someone says to kind of double down on it, to highlight it for others. Or you can put in a hyperlink of a resource that you thought of that might be helpful to your colleagues. We really want to make this webinar format as collaborative as we can. And as you use that chat box, feel free to at a name. So if you're responding to someone, so you could say at Shantae, that was a great point you made, etc. And not just us, I just used Shantae's name because I'm looking at her, but anybody who's in the chat box. Also, we have link, that bit.ly link will go to this webinar sheet. It'll take you right. It's a unique link. Will take you right to the webinar for us, leveraging the UDL 3.0 guidelines for inclusive learning in California. And it'll have the slides. The slides are linked in there, and you can click those slides if you want to get to there. And it also has some resources. So all the videos and things that we have in our slide deck are there, as well as the resources that we are alluding to, as well as some readings, some additional like extension readings. We got El Dorado County office. Nice. Janelle, thank you. Nice to have you with us. Myra, good to see you. Thank you for introducing yourselves. Our agenda today is going to be a quick UDL overview, and then we're going to go over the big main changes in the Guidelines 3.0. We've kind of bucketized them into four of the big themes of the changes: identity, bias, collective learning, and learner agency. And then that's going to be all of our time because we're going to have to go through those pretty quickly. So our goals for today are to understand the overarching themes of the UDL guidelines and the connections they're making to them in inclusive learning in California, and to identify some practical strategies. We try to come up with some practical strategies to leverage those UDL guidelines in your work. A quick review of what we're talking about when we're talking about universal design for learning. We have these foundational principles, which is the top line that you'll see on this slide. In order to use the UDL guidelines effectively, we sort of must make these shifts in the way that we think and the way that we talk about learning. So we shift our lens to look for the barrier in the design and not the learner. We know that every student is variable, that variability is the norm, and that it's contextual. It depends on where you are as to what pieces of variability show up, and it can be planned for using those universal design for learning guidelines. And the goal of UDL is for all of our students to have agency, for learner agency. And we use those UDL guidelines by first setting clear goals, anticipating the variability of our learners, and designing options to minimize those barriers that those students are coming across. And we can find those barriers in many pieces of our curriculum. They'll show up in the goals, in the materials, how things are represented, the methods, how the content is being delivered, the assessments, how the learning is being demonstrated, and the environment. How is the climate and culture supportive of learning? And then we have these UDL guidelines to think about reducing those barriers, and they come along these lines of learner variability. So we know our students vary in their interests and their identities. So those universal design for learning guidelines gives us clues or ideas about how to reduce barriers in that area. We know they vary in how they are able to put forth effort and persist in their emotional capacity, and how they perceive content, the language and symbols they understand, how they build knowledge, how they interact, how they communicate, and how they develop their strategies. So because of that, those UDL guidelines have some ideas for what you can do to address the barriers that variable learners might encounter in our learning environment and in our lesson plans.
And so we want to use this time now to accentuate you to the updated guidelines, or the enhanced guidelines, if you will. I have put in the chat a copy of them, and these are the guidelines. And so the guidelines 3.0, which were released at UDL Con, that was held in your neck of the woods, right? In your state at the end of July. And so, like I said, I put them in the chat. And so I want to kind of reiterate that the UDL Guidelines 3.0 is still a set of common language. It's a set of guidelines really to help us as we're designing instruction and as we are making instructional decisions. It is still a way to address learner variability, right? We have some additional enhancements in terms of what learner variability consists of, and we'll talk about that in just a tad bit. It is still a summary of research. So we have, again, of course, have the foundational set of research where we incorporated the neuroscience, the cognitive science, the learning sciences, but we have also, in the spirit of UDL, added various types of research, so varying methodologies, varying perspectives, both in the authors and the research themselves, and the participants that were responsible for a lot of the research. So we are varying and broadening the type of research in which the UDL guidelines have been based. And so I will put a link in the chat, but also know that the research is available for you. Throughout this entire process, we've been very transparent in why and how the research has been enhanced. And so we want to make sure that you have privy to that information as well. Again, it is still a tool for anticipating barriers. Just as Melissa said, that is one of the things that we pride ourselves on, is being able to proactively look at what's hindering our learners from being successful, both in the classroom and out. And so we have expanded what barriers consist of in this too. We will talk about later on in this webinar. And again, it is still guidance for design, right? And so, hence the name, Universal Design for Learning. We still want to make sure that you all, or everyone, is using these set of tools as a guideline for instructional decision-making. And so we'll get into some of the overarching changes that you'll see that we'll present to you just now. Melissa, I think we're good.
All right. So
okay.
What are the key ways in which we've expanded these UDL guidelines? So as we looked at our 2.0, we noticed that we talked a lot about the why of learning, that's our engagement guidelines, the what of learning, that's our representation guidelines, how we're representing our content. and the how of learning, how do our students show what they know? How do they demonstrate their understanding? But we didn't really think too much in these guidelines around the who of learning. What is the identity of these learners, and how can we make space for those learners when they come to our classes, when they come to our schools? So we have in the new guidelines started to emphasize identity as part of learner variability. We also talk a lot about barriers when we talk about UDL. And so the new guidelines, we decided to expand the concept of barriers to include individual, institutional, and systemic bias as a barrier. So you'll see address bias show up in 3 different places in our guidelines, and each of the principles, each of the networks. We also noticed that there's a lot of support for individuals in these guidelines, and we wanted to emphasize the value of interdependence and collective learning throughout them, and shift us from teacher-centered, this is what teachers will do, this is what teachers will provide, to learner-centered, so that both teachers and learners could use these guidelines. So if you want to dig into some of the writings and the details of these guidelines on the bottom of this slide, as well as in the home-based document or the webinar document, as the full draft, which explains it, all the changes all the way through, the new graphic organizer, which has been put in the chat a couple times, a one-pager explanation, and then a webinar that was a webinar to release the changes of the guideline. So as we dive in, we've sort of organized our webinar in each of those big 4 buckets. But as we dive in, I just wanted you to think about one change that grabbed your attention that you wish to explore further. So you can talk about identity, you can think about those big buckets, but you can also put on the screen some of the smaller considerations that have been added. So let's just take 30 seconds, think about what you want to lean into in this moment. Got promoting joy in the chat. Yay.
I'm so excited that someone put that in there. Oh, more than one.
Oh, lots of
Another
people.
person. We love it.
Addressing biases, modes of expression, communication. Nice. I like that one.
And I will tell y'all, just like an insider's note, that joy and play was actually one that we got a little pushback from the audience, believe it or not. Like, we forget that teaching and learning should be joyful, right? And so I'm glad that you all are excited about that particular consideration. So we've moved away from using the word checkpoint, and the new terminology for what formerly known as checkpoints are considerations. We found that people were using checkpoints as like checklists. And so we want to ensure that, as we're building our language as our vocabulary, that we make that note to you all as well.
Great.
Challenging exclusionary practice. That's another one that I love. Like, we've gone beyond just inclusive practices and are at the point now where we should be really looking at our policies, our practices at both the school, district, and state levels to see are there pieces that's precluding or preventing students from being successful in our learning environments,
Great. Shaman wishes she could thumb up some of these
I
comments.
know, me too.
Not possible in a webinar. Lots around addressing bias. Awesome. Students being seen. Perceptions of people, culture, and language. Awesome. And someone would like to unpack bias, so we will try to do that.
Yes,
we tried to cram a lot in, so we're going to try to get to everything.
That's right. And just for your purposes too, I'm sorry, Melissa, if you go back one, at the bottom of this slide too, that second where it says key changes, a key changes document actually has the specific side-by-side 2.0 and 3.0 changes, just for your reference there.
Nice. And the reason all these changes were made and the reason we use UDL is to develop learner agency. So the goal of UDL is learner agency that is purposeful and resourceful, authentic and resourceful, strategic and action oriented. I'm going to do that one more time because I said resourceful twice. Purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, and strategic and action oriented. So we made all those big changes to increase learning that is those things and to increase access to learner agency for our students. So our first key change, identity. Identity is key to learner agency. So what does identity mean? When we're talking about identity in this context, we're talking about our sense of self. what makes us unique, and has continuity over time. So that might include many aspects of a person that's not in their control, such as family, culture, background, physical features, but also includes ways that they've sort of shaped themselves and shaped their lives. And some of these have been passed down. It includes their values, their morals, their beliefs, their ethics. So quick little story from my background as an alternative ed principal. One of my students, who is pictured here, but I what do you call it?
Redacted.
I redacted. I smiley faced out her face for her own privacy, but that's me a very long time ago. And she was an immigrant from Africa, and she survived a refugee camp on their way to Boston. So they went from their home country to another African country, and then to Boston. And while she was in what we would call her homeschool, a traditional schooling situation, she not only had to catch up on her studies, but she also had to take care of her 4 little brothers and sisters while her parents worked 2 jobs to sort of afford a life in Boston. So the school she attended prior to coming to alternative school was not able to continue her enrollment because she had missed too many days taking care of her siblings. So when she came to our school, we had a program where she could earn credit for what she knew and was able to do and work asynchronously so she could attend to her family needs and her schoolwork. But what seemed to be the most powerful to her was in English class. She worked on a personal narrative project. So she was able to tell her story of how she immigrated and how she went to that refugee camp and what happened there and how she came to America and what impact that had on her and how she thinks about herself. And through that process, she was able to reclaim her love for learning. And she found a little bit more about herself. So as she was able to bring her identity into the learning process, she in some ways healed from those bad school experiences, and it opened the door for her to build more learner agency and take agency over her learning. So it's just a little sort of vignette of the ways in which bringing identity into the learning can really help our students access it in a deeper way and really address that affective network that we always talk about in the brain in the engagement guidelines. So some of the new considerations that are related to identity is in some ways, it's almost that whole guideline, that whole top left guideline, welcoming interests and identities, nurture joy and play, bringing in their cultural joy, their cultural play, recognizing expectations and beliefs and motivations, cultivating understanding, respect across language and dialects. And when we respect where students come from, they're better able to engage. Representing a diversity of perspectives and identities in authentic ways is a new consideration, really thinking about what are the doors that where students are walking through, what are the windows, how do they see themselves and how do they see other people? Varying the methods for response and navigation and movement, honoring each way that a student chooses based on who they are and where they come from to navigate the learning environment, and address biases as it relates to modes of expression and communication. So you'll see that even though identity is really like kind of in that one chunk in the top left, there are ways in which identity can kind of be brought in across all the new considerations and even some of the returning considerations. And that's going to be true for all of these main concepts. So some strategies that you can use to address identity and help students bring their whole selves to learning are things like counter narrative projects, self-reflection to content and activities, really thinking about how do I respond to these things, creating a space for learners to find joy through connections to their identity and sense of self and communities, and allow for multiple ways for students to engage based on their culture. So we're going to watch this this little video. It's about 2 minutes long about this, and your sort of reflection question is, what do you do already to encourage students to bring identity to their learning?
Young people's racial and cultural identities are critically important. And we have to acknowledge that the way we have set up opportunities for learning and development are not always respectful of the diversity that we have in this country. As we are thinking about how to maximize chances that young people are thriving, it's important to let them lead with their identity. Not bury it, but lead with it. Show it off, be proud of it, actually display it, to perform it, to put it up on the stage, to put it up on the screen, to make videos about it, to write poetry about it. So they are really bringing themselves into the room. If I come into a space and I don't trust this space and I don't bring my full self into this space, the behavior that you see may not be reflection of my competence. It's a reflection of me not being motivated to show you what I have because I don't trust this situation. If I don't have a relationship with you and I don't get to be a little bit more of who I am, you're going to slow down my learning and development by not knowing me. Schools and community organizations and families and the overall sort of environment of the community are all playing a role in shaping the experiences and contexts and relationships where learning happens. That basically is what the science of learning and development has told us, that all adults, all settings, all experiences matter.
So go ahead and react if you'd like in the chat. What are some things that you thought about? If you have any ideas for your colleagues that are also in this webinar around how they could do a project, some projects you've done, or some links to videos about bringing identity into the learning. What's most powerful for me about that video is that idea is if I don't make space for the whole student, for them to be all of themselves, I really don't know what they can do, right? So that's a barrier, not only to them, but also a barrier to my ability to assess what they're able to do. And Shamron has seen a lot of connections to other California frameworks. You want to say anything else about that, Sham?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Shamron. I'm happy to. We had a discussion today in one of our sessions about the new California standards for the teaching profession, the CSTPs, and it's just dripping with this and seeing those connections. And so I'm excited to see how this plays out. And I anticipate a lot of crosswalks starting to develop with really connecting this to what we're already doing in practice and being able to utilize this as a tool to, enhance our work. So such cool things coming along.
Nice. Great. Thank you. And there's lots of ideas in the chat. Lisa's wondering how our systems might teach our learners to make them so small, bury their identities. Such an important question for us to ask ourselves. And as we do that, other important questions are around bias. So I'm going to turn it over to Shantae to talk about this.
Yeah, so many great things coming in the chat. And I, first and foremost, just wanted to give Taylor a shout out who talked about the subtle changes in our provide options for and our design option for. And as we talk about identity, it's so important to recognize that we aren't the only ones in the classroom, right? And so as educators, we design, but we should be co-designing. And so the guidelines, first and foremost, want to position ourselves in more of an asset-based, right, approach, but also in recognizing that the teaching and learning goes both ways. We learn just as much from our students as our students are learning from us. And so we want to make sure that we're emphasizing that in designing options for these guidelines. And so as we look towards who is in the classroom, the other people besides our little folks, right, in the classroom is us. And so we bring into the classroom, of course, our own perspectives, our own identities, our own individuals. I always say, who is the teacher that's teaching? Who is the person that's teaching? So if you will, Melissa, can you go to the next slide? What we bring with us, in addition to our expertise and our perspectives, because of this, is our own bias, right? And so when sometimes we use that word and we aren't quite sure what that means. And so bias is those things. First and foremost, let me just say bias is natural. It's not a bad thing. It's what happens as a result of the bias that we have. So what is bias? It's our tendencies or our behaviors that have shaped what we do and how we think because of our experiences, right? And they're automatic. They are what has kept us alive as a species. They are what has kept us grounded in what it is that we do. They're a natural reaction. So if you are presented with something that's different from what you're used to, that bias is how you react to that thing. And so it has, again, been developed through our own values, through our teaching. Psychologically, literally, there are like 230 different biases, right? And so I put down there that there are 180 different cognitive biases. There are 10 different behavioral biases. But the most important thing, as we talk about, is it's not just that biases exist, it's us being aware that we're coming into a learning space with those thoughts, with those perspectives, with those biases. And so we have to be cognizant of how those perceptions impact the decisions that we make instructionally, the things that we quote unquote tolerate, the things that we value, the things that we see that we sometimes may push on our individual learners. So Melissa, you can go to the next slide. So here we are offering you a video about how bias may show up. And a lot of times bias may show up unintentionally, but what we want to recognize is the impact it is having on our learners. And so I ask, as you watch this video, do you see yourself in this? Again, it's not a bad thing. It's becoming aware that you may resonate with some of the actions that happen in this video, but how can your awareness of this bias really lead itself to more inclusive practices and challenging exclusive practices? So Melissa, if you would start the video.
Good morning. How are you?
Cool.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
Hey, you think I got a funny looking face?
Hey kids, I'm telling you, go right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm gonna have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair.
Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends, too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you just like everybody else. You think you see, but you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop!
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
And so, friends, I really do ask that you first not look at this as a dramatization, because I swear I've heard this conversation in some of the counseling offices that I've been in privy to. And so I'd love for you to just give us your thoughts as it relates to bias. It's whether you saw yourself in this video, if you feel comfortable divulging that, or even thinking about where possibly bias has been or has existed in your everyday practice, right? And so a lot of times we aren't cognizant of how our own perceptions impact others. And so just in the video, it's so clear to me how it may have been unintentional on some of the participants' part, but the impact that it has, even years later, on our individual students, that's so powerful, and that is long standing, if you will.
Shantae, if I can share what I told
Please.
you today.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I was working in alternative high schools in Boston, I remember when I first started, I grew up with a parent who was a school teacher. So she was forever correcting my American Standard English. So I kind of thought that was part of how you interacted with people. And my students would speak what as researchers call African American vernacular English, AVE. And they had different rules for verbs. And so they would say something to me, and then I would correct them with American Standard English, and they would say, yeah, that's what I said. Because it meant the same thing. It was just like a different form of language. And I realized throughout that, they were trying to communicate to me, and I was responding with, no, you actually should communicate to me in this way. And that sort of interrupted our relationship. So I really like our new checkpoint, not to give away your punchline.
No, you're good.
Our new checkpoint around cultivating understanding and respect across language
and dialects. And that's so important. That's actually a skill, right? In my community, the ability to code switch is something I purposefully teach my children, because that is a survival skill, right? You know, depending on the culture, depending on who you are around, it's important to know how to position yourself, but also to be true to who you are, right? And so when we think about our considerations, one thing I love, and someone made mention of this in the chat, is there are several considerations that are within the guidelines that do address bias. And so under engagement, we talk about addressing biases, threats, and distractions, right? When these biases occur, what are we doing? How are we designing to minimize those threats? The other thing too, as Melissa mentioned, is that are these ideas of symbols and understanding respect. It's not that it's wrong, right, to speak differently, right? It is a way of embracing different perspective, a way at actually learning as a teacher how to communicate and build relationships with the learners that you are engaging with, right?
Really important in California because you have a lot of multi-language.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And then the addressing modes of communication when we look under action and expression. And so a lot of times when we think about action and expression, we think about how learners are communicating with us. And sometimes we tend to think that one form of communication is better than the other, right? So I'll give you an example. Like writing has historically been a way to really suppress some of our historically marginalized subgroups, right? Because writing wasn't a skill historically that's always been taught. And so we sometimes think that writing is, I don't know, better than storytelling, better than oral expression, better than, right? And so one way to address this bias is to, again, accept all forms of communication as equal, right? Or as having the same level of meaning. All right, Melissa. These are just some examples as to how we can sometimes how we may find some of our common biases in our process and products and processes. And so a lot of times, if you think about again what we value, we want to look at making sure that we're becoming more aware of those biases that we bring into our classroom. So I'm going to start on the right-hand side with some of our anti-bias strategies. Practicing mindfulness. So like I said, bias is natural, right? But how can we become aware of those biases so that when we make decisions, we aren't basing those decisions on our own biases? And there's a great article in the home base that looks at 3 specific ways that you can acknowledge and actually practice mindfulness to help reduce your biases. The other thing is that just recognizing that, again, bias doesn't make us bad. It makes us human. But it's what we do and how we're impacting our learners as a result of those biases. Being open to hearing others' opinions. Again, if we don't work together, if we don't have those relationships, we aren't open to other perspectives and other opinions. And then practicing responding rather than reacting. So if someone says something to you, rather than be defensive and tell them, no, that's not the right way, listen to how what you said, did, or even thought may have impacted, but also listen. It's a time to listen. It's a time to enjoy the diversity of those around us. And then the next bullets there on the other side are just some other common biases, and I'll just highlight a few. So I talked about the writing that we sometimes may make more higher on our value list than speaking or drawing. Another thing that we talk about within, and we'll get to it too, is also the importance of collaboration. So that next bullet, working solo, we think that if students aren't able to do it independently, that it's better than working in groups. And so we've recognized from a research standpoint that collaboration is really important in not only diversifying how we think, but also it's been linked to students being able to be more successful in various skills. So these are just some ways that we can begin to think about how bias may show up in our actual classrooms.
And the last one sort of speaks to what Angelica said, that she was
yes.
about biases when working with students with disabilities, right? And cultivating environment.
Absolutely right. And there is a great link to a video where we talked about, talk about not, I forget what it's called, but I think
Decriminalizing supports by Shelley Moore.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's in there. So that goes to your point. Thank you.
Shantae, I want to add something to what you said on the previous slide.
Yeah.
So I was just in Canada and I did intro to UDL. And so I was at an international school. And so one of the things that I think is important to note with the bullet around working solo is more complex, that bullet. is that, you know, what we've learned through the research is that, you know, we may not know every student's culture coming in, but we can acknowledge that, you know, students come to us and their cultures are more individual in nature. And some students come to us where they come from backgrounds where it's more collective. So having the option of, you know, solo versus like the collective learning as, you know, your everyday option will help us to address the cultural piece that we may not be able to directly recognize, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to make sure
absolutely. Thank
that
you.
was said.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Brenda. Just because we know that choice is a powerful option, especially as it relates to you, right? The next thing, go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Melissa?
I was just going to say that dovetails right into our next one, right? Thinking about collective learning. Yeah.
That's right. And so we, again, part of the overarching changes of the guidelines is to kind of hone in on this idea of collective learning and its power in actual learning learner agency. So you can go to the next slide, my dear. When it comes to some of the new considerations or enhanced consideration, there is a emphasis on the power of belonging in community. So we talk about building relationships. We say it all the time. What I love now is that the UDL guidelines are explicitly talking about developing and belonging within the community and being aware of those around us. And actually, you know, cultivating empathy, being open to different perspectives, building relationships, and purposefully using restorative practices to mend some of those broken relationships that we may have unintentionally broken, right? And so also as it relates to representation, diversity and perspective. Like I love this whole idea of learners being able to show up as their authentic selves, right? And so in action, word, and deed, and us being in a space where we can capitalize on that to really make sure that those practices are relevant to them, despite or in spite, in addition to like their varying walks of life. Also cultivated ways of knowing. This one is kind of near and dear to my heart, is one that I did a lot of research on. And so we talk about the ways of knowing. How is it that we're presenting information? Are we presenting information from a diverse pool of authors, a diverse way of thinking, even as it relates to math, right? To math and those things that we tend to teach in a very limited scope. How can we give meaning to and bring authenticity to some of the other cultural ways of knowing? The last one is, again, addressing bias, which we've talked about in challenge exclusionary practices. Again, it's this emphasis on students learning more as a collective, right? And so that they understand each other's perspectives.
And thinking about how can they build knowledge together? How can they express together? How can all these things be community activities?
Right, because I learn more when we learn together, right? The two brains are always better than one, right? How you look at it. And so just some specific strategies as it relates to collective learning. And some of these you may be very familiar with, right? And so we're just saying that the guidelines are explicitly calling this out. We're seeing the value in that the collective learning strategy. So things like collaborative work groups, think pair shares, problem-based learning, because again, it's bringing in multiple perspectives to solve a particular problem. During gallery walks, so that people can see others' ways of doing, ways of knowing. And then of course, we always want to incorporate technology. So how we all use Google Docs, right? Isn't it awesome when we're able to collaborate on a particular thing towards a common goal?
I think this is a 5-minute video, so we might ask people if they want to watch that at a different time.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
And then maybe talk a little about the benefits of collective learning.
Melissa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Hold on, espérate.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, but I couldn't hear you. It's all good. So real quick, Shante and Melissa, going back to the previous slide. So if I am a participant, I might look at that list where we're talking about the collaborative structures. And I remember being a student in college in the 90s, we were finally being coached to not have our learners in rows, right?
Yes.
And so I think pair, share, jigsaws and all that. And so as a cautionary tale, friends, I would say that as we're considering these collective learning strategies, that lens of UDL gives us permissions for options, right? So I remember back in the day, it was like, okay, we're all going to be think, pair, share, everybody all together, think, pair, share at the same time. But through that lens of universal design for learning, I'm going to have an option for a learner who might not be ready to pair or to share. Right. So that nuance, if we could speak a little bit to that, because otherwise I might walk away thinking, oh, I'm already doing it. I'm already checking the boxes. What is the and? What is the yes and to that from your perspectives?
For sure. When we think about
Sure, I was gonna say.
when we think about encouraging like different cultures to show up as they are, and then collective learning strategies, there are some cultures that are more independent focused and some more cultures that are collective focused. You want to make room for both of those. But you also want to build students' abilities to collaborate. So thinking about how do you scaffold the collaboration when collaboration is the goal, things like group roles, protocols, sentence starters, things like that to scaffold if the goal is to collaborate. If the goal is content, maybe you have a collaboration option and an independent option.
The other thing too is as we talk about collaborative group work, this is also an opportunity to really hone in on student strengths. And so when there are roles that are decided upon by the learners as to how they want to participate in group activities, it does allow them to shine, right? Because they can tap into their own strengths. They can tap into how they are able to strengthen the group. And so making sure that those opportunities are available for them to really get into what they feel like is their best mode of communication or expression.
Yeah, allow them to choose those roles too.
That's right. That's right.
You want to talk a little bit about our benefits of collective learning, Shante?
Yeah, so I feel like we really have talked about many of them. So just that shared responsibility. So again, we're working towards a common goal, right? And so having the shared, having the strengths and interests of students really does allow us to diversify what it is we're doing. Diverse perspectives. So again, students learn from one another. I don't know what you know. If I don't know what you know, you don't know what I know. If we don't have that opportunity to talk about it and to work towards a common good. I remember an example. We were all. This was like non-academic example, but it was a group of surgeons in a medical doing surgery, and it was so interesting how their different perspectives, their language, their way of expression, their way of holding utensils made the surgery even just that better, because we all had a different perspective in which we were approaching the same goal. Communication skills and critical thinking are also just paramount to teamwork, right? And really life. And so looking at how we can pose questions and solve problems. The only thing, and so this just helps with some of the collaboration as it relates to problem solving.
Awesome. And all of this is aimed at that learner agency. So another, smiley face redacted pictures. Just really quick, in my second school that I ran, we had a family day, and we had students who served as family engagement interns because we were placing students at work sites and didn't have enough. So we used ours as one, and there were family engagement interns. And this is kind of how it sort of all comes together in some ways. So what they wanted to bring in a bouncy house in their family day. And the staff that were assigned as their mentors were like, you guys are 14 to 24. You do not need a bouncy house. In fact, we probably cannot allow the bouncy house to be used by you. And they said, no, we want a bouncy house. That's what we need at our family day. because they knew their culture, they knew their community, and they knew that bouncy house was going to be paramount to having people come to the family day. So they ignored all warnings, all discouragement, and they went and they got themselves quotes at these different places that would bring it. They figured out how to get it there. They figured out where it could go. All these strategy developments they did sort of on their own. They figured out how to open a purchase order in a large urban district. If you've ever done that, that is very hard. All they needed was my signature. So they brought in their identity, right? They brought in the idea of their culture. They knew their people better than we did. They brought in collective learning. They worked together, right? They brought in bias. They said, we're not gonna listen to you're telling us what we need. We know what we need, right? All those things came together, and we had the most well-attended family day of any family day, because the students were saying, come to my family day. They weren't saying, come to Miss Sanjay's family day, come to, my school's family day, come to my family day. And the bouncy house bounced the whole day. Now, there was mostly little cousins and, sisters, and that's little brothers and sisters and that sort of thing. Every once in a while, we'd catch a 20-year-old in there. I'm not going to lie, but it was well attended, and it kind of bounced all day long. So what can we do across all of these things to think about learner agency? And the reason we didn't pull out the particular checkpoints for learner agency is because they all are aimed at learner agency. We do all of these things so our students can be independent in their learning. But some big pieces are choice, thinking about having students set their own goal and self-directing their learning. That co-design piece that Shantae encouraged us to do, really talk to the students, see what works for them, where are their barriers, what can we design to reduce those barriers, and regular feedback and reflection, not only for students, but for us, asking our students for feedback on their learning. So our reflection question for this piece is, how do you put your students in charge of your own learning? So in the last few moments, we'll put that, if you wouldn't mind, Shamron, putting that link to the video in the chat as well. It's also in our resources, so you can watch it later. But we wanted to give a little guidelines challenge. We'll just take maybe 1 minute or 30 seconds to look at this problem of practice. Think about all these 3.0 changes that we talked about, and think about how you might address it. And you can put it in the chat to express your ideas. So let's say our problem of practice is students are not using the skills and strategies taught in writing lessons independently across contexts. So what are some of these new checkpoints, or some ideas from these new 3.0 checkpoints that could address this problem of practice? So you're going to have to sort of hypothesize what the barrier is. And if any of our panelists have any ideas, you can play the game too. You can respond to the challenge. The writing lesson may not allow students to input, use their own identities and interests. Yeah, mine might not be interesting to me, right? That might be a barrier. Awesome. Any others?
Melissa, the word that jumps at me is independently. Like sometimes I need to think by myself, but then sometimes I need my friends to think and then go by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. So could we work on it together? What strategies does each already use that they could teach others? Oh, that's a great idea, Diana. Wonderful. If there are access to tools, text, graphic organizer in different contexts. Good question, Megan. Awesome. All right, we have 2 minutes left, and I know that there's some housekeeping that Brenda wants to jump in. Oh, how has the writing been framed in other content areas? Good question, Shannon. So possible next step, as you reflect on the ideas that have been shared today, what's affirmed your thinking, pushed your thinking, or what might your learners need you to do next? So those are some things for you to take away with you. Think about what's your next step, sort of set your intentions, and I'll turn the last minute over to Brenda to do the final housekeeping.
Thank you, Melissa. So following the webinar today, we will be posting a link to the recording on the CISA website. So be sure to go there, as well as Top Tips and Got a Minute. Those two resources combined will extend and support your learning on this topic for today. So look out for those. And then our next webinar, if you can advance to the next slide, on September 30th will be facilitated by Susan Shapiro. She's a CAST colleague, as well as Jessica Lambert. She is out of the Fresno County office on the topic UDL and community partnerships. So I hope to see you there. And then lastly, we would love to hear from you. We are always eager to improve on this webinar experience. So please follow the link, scan the QR code, and provide some feedback. That would be awesome if you could do that. And then again, also any other questions or resources you have, feel free to reach out, and then go ahead and connect with the CISA website so you can see other resources that are there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been great to hear your voices and experiences, and can't wait to see the application of this and the implications across the field. So very grateful. We look forward to seeing folks out and about, and we look forward to seeing you at our webinar coming up next month. So reach out as always to any of us with questions or content or ideas. We'd love to hear from you and engage with you further. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Shamron, can you answer the question Emily has in the chat about use?
Let me look at it. Questions in regards to the first page of these slides. Information has just been fabulous. I want to confirm that can be shared in the world of education as long as slides are not altered. Yes, that's correct. One of the generous things that we have in our partnership with CAST is they're very generous with their content. We just want to make sure that we don't change the branding and we don't change the content that's on the slides. If you have additional information that you want to add additional slides, you can, but that's a great question. CAST has been very gracious and supportive of our work in California, and shares their intellectual property and expertise very freely and willingly. So thanks again for that. And it is our hope that this gets shared widely across the state. We are creating this as we go, and it's a great opportunity for us to have more coherence and connection as we build this UDL model across the state. So grateful for the question.
Diana, I'm sorry you had to write so fast. I tried to put on my New York speech to get through everything. But yes, hopefully you can go back and slow us down and take notes on the slides.
Great. Thank you, Melissa and Shantae and Brenda and Dariela in the background and Elisa. Happy to have you all join us today. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.